Well, welcome to the Protestant Path podcast. Thank you for tuning in as we explore the historical and theological roots of Protestantism. We address the contemporary challenges and chart a faithful path forward. In this podcast, we discuss church history, current cultural topics, and we do our best to put forth the case that the Protestant tradition is superior to other Christian traditions, not because we are the smartest or most savvy or have the best marketing strategy, but because classical Protestant tradition and the church, it's the most faithful to the teaching of Christ's apostles, aka it's biblical. And so we hope and we pray that this content discussed here will be used by God to present this case and encourage those inside the Protestant tradition, as well as those outside the Protestant tradition that they would consider classical Protestantism. On today's episode, we'll continue discussing the doctrine of the two kingdoms from Martin Luther, the great reformer, and this will be conceptualized in three estates: church, house, and government. In our last episode, we discussed the estate of the household, and today we'll be diving into government, and we'll use a couple different words interchangeably. But I'm David, and I'm joined by my co-host, Barrett. Welcome, Barrett.
What's going on, David? Glad to be here.
Yeah, man. All right, so to kick things off as we jump into this topic, let me just start us off with a quote from the great reformer, and we'll just kind of get rolling, and I'll turn it over to you. So let me read this from Martin Luther. Government is divinely ordained authority to exercise worldly dominion by divine right. Government is the deputyship of God on earth. All right, so we're into it, man. So we're going to be discussing the government today. And you did a lot of the hard work and putting this outline together and kind of helping me. So yeah, man, turn it over to you. You can kind of lead the way as we discuss the estate of the government.
Thanks a lot, brother. Yeah, and before we jumped on, you and I were talking a little bit about how the topic could be controversial, and we definitely live in a divided age. And so what we're going to do for our listeners is try to defend and present 5 propositions to kind of paint a picture of what the Protestant doctrine of the state or the civil authority or the Christian prince or the rulers or the regime, however you want to title it. We're going to try to summarize that in, I think, 5 propositions. And I think as we think about these things, chew on them, reflect on them, we'll kind of see how our tradition has really understood these things and how it has a very practical implication for how we conduct ourselves. So I'd like to start with a quote by the great Lutheran political philosopher Friedrich Stahl. And he says, quote, "The state is the molding of the human condition according to moral ideas. And since Christianity is the divine manifestation of the moral ideas of these conditions of life, it stands to reason that Christianity must determine the nature of the state." Now with that, we'll start with the first proposition. The first proposition is the state and its sovereignty is from God. We'll read Romans chapter 13. "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." That's Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. And then finally, the same thing, but stated much simpler. The blessed apostle Peter, 1 Peter 2:17. "Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." So the authority comes from God. What does this mean? Well, for one, it tells us that however these governmental authorities came into power, whether that was by ambition, by an election, by being born of the previous king, vice, however that is, our faith is telling us that their role, their authority is ultimately from God. that they are God's plan for enforcing his will and his justice in this institution. Now, because of this, he's given that job, that vocation, that authority structure, power. Power even so intense that they can put people to death. Romans 13 calling him a minister, it's literally diakonos, God's deacon, God's servant, to enforce his order. Now, this is highly contextual, right? It's culturally formed, it's historically rooted, but nevertheless, it is from God. To kind of quote the end of Psalm, David is singing and saying, "My eyes shall be on the faithful of the land, that they may dwell with me. He who walks in a way that is perfect shall serve me. He who works deceit shall not dwell within my house, and he who tells lies shall not continue in my presence. Early I destroy all the wicked of the land, that I may cut off all the evildoers from the city of the Lord." Okay. So we were talking about this a little bit offline, David. What is different about the Christian tradition and non-Christian traditions is non-Christian traditions can easily accept that there are like all kinds of state authorities in the world, right? There's a dictator,
Yeah.
there's a bad guy. We're talking about the Ayatollah, right? Like it's kind of might makes right, right? Everybody has a boss, but not everybody necessarily thinks that boss is, there because of God. And our faith is teaching us that the government, the authorities are from God. I think that immediately puts us in this position where, like Romans 13 is saying, and First Peter is saying, that we do owe them like we have obligations to them. But just like we talked about with the household, right? A father is given authority, but that authority is for a purpose. And that purpose means that it's not just arbitrary. They're playing some kind of game, right? And we used, I think, a lot of sports analogies last time. So if the government is playing football because God has, preordained them to do so, they also are accountable to him for this office, meaning their power isn't just given because they can have power, but their power is given for a purpose. And that purpose, if you go to Romans 13, is for our good, to enforce his justice on earth and ultimately to order the social order in a way that meets our temporal needs. So it would mean they're accountable to him, at least in this office, and that role, that place of being a Christian magistrate, judge, or mayor is a vocation. It is a calling. It is something that God calls certain men into, and he will hold them accountable for exercising that vocation properly. So that's kind of our first proposition.
All right, dude. Oh, man. I love when you put the outlines together. You're so thorough and think of things that I never would have thought of or been aware of, just even historically. And yeah, as we've kind of talked even, offline a bit, prepping for this is the episode that I was like, I even text you, earlier in the week was like, hey man, like I need more study time, prep time, please, help me kind of think through these things. Cause that's the one that I feel this is most out of my wheelhouse. Like if we're talking soteriology, justification, how that kind of has been thought about, I feel a bit more comfortable. But this one, kind of these social ethics and the things that we're going to be discussing. So I'm going to depend on you a lot. One of the things that I heard that really brings a lot of comfort to me, and I think maybe our listeners would benefit to think about this as well, is that as dysfunctional or corrupt or as evil as a government may seem to us, or may even be, we can take great comfort that our God is not out of control. Like the sovereignty piece is really something that gets highlighted. I know in that particularly the Reformed tradition, it's something that we just keep coming back to when we're talking about, more kind of soteriological issues of salvation and election and all those things. But I still think, needs to be highlighted that the institution of government, God is sovereign over that. The only reason that it exists and has real authority is because it comes from God. That's what Jesus says. All authority has been given to me. And so the things that he puts forward, we talk about the institution of the church, that Christ founded that, and that'll be, in future episodes. But the institution of government, the only reason that it has any actual real authority is because it's given authority by the one who possesses all authority. And so we can take great comfort. Sometimes we can be a bit confused as to what is our God doing by allowing certain people to rise and fall. Sometimes it seems like it's a zero-sum game. The bad guy's always winning. But that's something that's so rich in our tradition, is that no, this is part of the temporal kingdom. It's not always going to be this way. And so as Luther lays out his two kingdoms doctrine, he has, the spiritual kingdom, the things that are eternal and ruled by the gospel. And then he has the temporal kingdom, which are ruled by, given authority here on this earth for a period of time. And when that time expires, to quote C.S. Lewis, when, the author walks on the stage, the play is over. And that will happen one day. He will walk on the stage. He will part the clouds and return. And the true, righteous, holy king will rule and reign. And the worldly governments will be no more, for we will have no need of them. But I think that that doesn't mean that just because there is a coming kingdom that's going to be perfect, that the kingdoms or the governments or civil magistrates that exist now don't have authority. And so it doesn't have to be an either or. And I think that a lot of times, particularly YouTube space or, TikTok, or kind of the culture that we exist in now in this online world, things the hyperbole gets out of control. And it's really kind of one or the other. The Pope has to be the king, or we're anarchists. We don't submit to anybody because Christ is king, and although that's true, it's given authority. And so it's real because it's given by a real God, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so I think, a couple of things to highlight there would just be the sovereignty of God, but then also that this estate that we're discussing is in the realm of the temporal kingdom. And so that means it has a date that it started, but it also has a date of expiration.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's hard because you and I, when we're prepping this episode for our listeners and trying to do a good job in articulating our tradition, it's hard because we live such downstream from Christianity and from Protestantism, right? So we take it for granted that the state has a mission, but we were talking about other religions. That is not obvious. I don't know. I mean, I don't know much about Hinduism, but I can tell you a lot of other religions, I don't think their gods teach them anything about the state. It happens to be there, right? Or maybe you have a religion like, I don't know, let's say like Talmudic Judaism. And in Talmudic Judaism, like maybe the king has a moral obligation to God, qua the king, but the state doesn't. There's not a concept of the rulers, right? It's just like individuals may or may not, but there's not like this vocation. There's not like this context. And I think it does kind of two things, right? We're talking about this in the family. Okay, like it's pretty easy to become a father. It's not easy to be a good father, right?
Yeah.
And in being a
Right.
father, we can say to people who are dads, let's say a non-believer, we can say to that person, hey, God has a plan for you as a father. God has a plan, a calling for you qua your
Yeah.
fatherhood. And it's
Yeah.
not up to you to decide, right? So we can go to a guy who finds himself a prince of some pagan country, and we're going to say, hey, it's not just that you got lucky and you get to spend your eternity in a lap of luxury doing whatever you want. God gave you those things to execute his will for the benefit of your subjects. And that is that's a very sanctifying role of the state. Like, cause it's a low threshold, right? To just be like, going back to the analogy of the household, it's not hard to become a father, but it is hard. It's a high standard to do it well. And God has a plan for those in that role. And I think that's a really significant contribution of our tradition that we take for granted. Like we take for granted that like no matter who the president is, we want the post office to function. Like whoever the mayor is, we want there to be a fire department, right? We don't want it to like expire when the mayor resigns and like we have to hire a whole new staff. No, we want it to
Right.
continue because we recognize that that role, that function has an obligation to people before God that is beyond like an individual life. And that is not actually a ubiquitous idea. So,
Right.
it sounds basic, but it's basic in the sense of this is the contribution of our faith, I think, to
Yeah.
whatever benefits that come out of the contemporary world. So,
Well, and it's things that we interact with every single day but we don't realize, and many times we fail to see that was the genius of God instituting it, right? And so we just kind of take for granted those things. Is like you said, like we want there to be a fire department. Well, that is all like a consequence of God instituting this estate. And so like we are safer and more cared for and protected. Like, do you really want to, if you don't have a government, who's gonna build jails and put bad kids away and keep the playground safe in the local park? So you don't have government, you don't have a mechanism to restrain evil, and therefore our lives are not as free or blessed and able to primarily worship God in the way that we want. And so I think there's just so many, even just like down to the smallest little things that like a local government would do or should do. Those are blessings. And what it should do is for us to be like, wow, God is so genius that he instituted even this because he cares about the material life and material world that we live in. And that should incite praise to his name. And yet many times we kind of take things for granted. We think the person that's at the top of the hill got there because they had a bigger stick, more power. They knew how to play the corruption game better than the next guy. And we fail to realize the genius of God in instituting this, because he doesn't just care about the spiritual eternal kingdom, but he does care about the temporal one. And so he's even good to us in that. And he will, I love that passage that you read earlier, he will hold accountable those who do not do a good job. There is account, that is why we're commanded to pray for them, because they will be held accountable to how they utilize the authority given. If they used it for themselves, it says he will hold them in derision. That's not a goal of anybody's life, is to be held in derision in the hands of the Lord. And so yeah, I think, man, there's just so many things there that we kind of take for granted. And like you said, I don't live in the United States currently, and live in a country where the primary worldview doesn't know how to think about or wrestle with, where is this structure come from? How do we operate with that given? And so, yeah, man, that's really, really good stuff.
Right. Yeah. Maybe last comment on that before moving on to our second proposition is, I mean, you go back to a lot of other societies, there's societies that believe the sovereign was a god,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And whether that was ancient Egypt or, the Japanese Shinto religion, believing the emperor is a god. And we would look at that as obviously like mythology, right? But you can see the motive, right? Like, what's the justification? Because if a society without Christ is seeking some reason to justify why I have the power and not you. And so if I say I descend from a god, I'm Thor's
Yeah,
son or whatever, that somehow now gives
right.
me a right to rule. Whereas we're saying, no, you can just be the guy that God has chosen in a mediatorial way, and that's legit. Like, you don't have to be a really good guy to become a father, but once you are there, you do have obligations to God. He has a plan for that vocation, and he wants you to over your people in a way that honors him and is for their good. So, all right, second proposition. And this is, the state's authority is not dependent on another institution. Okay, so when we hear this, we think, like, what's the big deal? At the time of the Reformation, this was a big deal. It was a big deal because you, for example, received your crown from the church, right? And
Right.
there were popes who would put kings under interdict for disobedience. And that meant
Yeah,
that
crazy.
all of their subjects were no longer bound to obey that king. And the reformers are coming along and saying, whoa, wait a second. Romans 13 is written when Emperor Nero is the emperor. It does not seem, indeed it's not, a requirement that the king be a Christian. It's not a requirement that he be favored by the church for him to be legitimate. None of that is actually necessary. He doesn't require anything else to create that office. He gets his authority from God. And that actually is like a pretty significant point, because it makes him stand in this kind of unique role. Again, we go back to the household, right? I think of like our viewership, going back to that discussion. If you are a father, you have your authority from God directly.
Yeah,
You
right.
didn't get it because you went to man school. You didn't get it because, right, something. You just have it. You just have it.
Yeah.
It's just a question
Yeah.
of, are you using it well? And the government is the same way. They have an authority. We can talk about like different like mediatorial forms of government. We're not really getting into that, but ultimately it does not require another institution, whether that be the church or the family or a particular bishop, to make a king. Okay. That only comes from God. And therefore, there's this unique sense in which that role is directly accountable to God as his servant, as his minister. Now, of course, it can be resisted properly when that person rebels against God. See the book of Daniel, right? When people who were serving the king refused to listen to the king when he ordered them to do something contrary to God's will. But I think it's worth pointing out that it doesn't require any mediation. Your pastor does not have to endorse the mayor for that mayor to be legitimate. And it stands in all of our confessions that you could have a non-believer, even a wicked man, be a legitimate king or be a legitimate ruler. And this stands true also for, going back to the household. You can have a bad father. He's still a father. Maybe he's, lost some authority because he's made bad, whatever, but his role doesn't disappear because he's a sinner or because he's not submitted to the church. The other side of that is it kind of prevents the church from getting overly entangled in secular things. And I mentioned that word secular. We talked about this a little bit offline. We don't mean secular like no God or no religion or no faith. That is a secular notion we reject. But we mean that in the Latin sense of secundo, like of this age, right? That
Yeah.
ultimately,
Right.
like they're there to do something that is a function, and they don't have to be a confessing Christian or a particular pious Christian for them to be legitimate. So that's our second proposition. I don't really have much else to say on that. If you have any
So
comments,
would you say, yeah,
jump in.
man. Okay. No, I like it. I think you make a good case for that. A couple of things I would just point out is, yeah, in means of resistance, as I've just kind of done a little bit of tried to do broader reading than Luther, so I kind of engaged a little bit of what did Calvin what was his kind of political ideology regarding, how the church and the government kind of interface. And then, yeah, it seems like Luther and Calvin probably would have been a little bit similar, like some of the resistance or ways that you would kind of protest or go against seemed a bit more mild than out in Scotland, you got John Knox
Yep.
and he's like, no, bro, you can throw down, you can revolt.
It's a Scott for
And
you.
yeah, that's yeah, exactly right. Have you seen Braveheart, bro? I mean, they didn't do anything subtle. So yeah, I mean, you get John Knox out there, and he's kind of like the other side of a little bit more spicy. You kind of got mild, and then he's gonna be a little bit more of a punch. And so it's not completely. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not like there's kind of one. Sometimes people think of the Reformation as like it happened in one location and then it spread. And that, yeah, I don't know how much we've talked about this through the podcast, but just like there were kind of like multiple reformations all coming together at the same time
Yep.
throughout Europe. And so, as you read about even the development of, I'm kind of trying to work on some content for the different solas, and like that wasn't like on this date somebody was giving a speech or a sermon and those five came out and then they got like concretized into reformed theology. It was just like anything else, kind of progressively unraveled and was discovered. Kind of the same with the reformers. They're not all the exact same. It didn't all happen in one place or at one time. It was a period where different figures kind of had their spin on it. And yeah, there isn't like one take on how do we resist. I think people were looking for that during COVID. It was like
Yes.
the evangelical church was like, what do we do? The government's saying we can't meet. At least that's how it was in California. So I guess what I'm trying to say is you could pull quotes or church history and make any case you wanted, because you could find somebody that would kind of support a position that you were looking to, put before your church or your elders or whatever, of how to resist. And so, yeah, I actually think that that's another strength of Protestantism, is that there's unity, but not uniformity. And there isn't just like a one size fits all. Yeah, that's kind of a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think that when dealing with the institution. Okay, so last point on this, and I want to get your thoughts on this. So are we kind of saying that our tradition classically has cared more, and what I mean more, like of a level of importance, we primarily care that the person that fills the role of like president is more capable of executing the job as opposed to like his personal soul. Like, I don't think some people will say the president of the United States, is a born again believer. And he said he doesn't know if he's going to get to heaven. There's lots of different opinions on that. I don't know. I don't really have an opinion, never met him, never talked with him. So wherever you land on that, that's fine. I just am saying more like the Protestant tradition is probably more concerned with the person understands that this is an institution founded by God, given authority by God, and their job is to do these specific things, restrain evil, provide a society that can flourish in worship. And that's what we're primarily concerned about. Now, secondarily, of course, do we hope that whoever fills that office has a relationship with the Lord? Of course, but that's not like we would rather have like a non-believer who does a really good job executing on the institution of government than like a born-again believer who has the liturgy memorized, but like sucks at his job.
Right.
And
Yeah,
I think sometimes Christians can kind of get confused with that. Like, well, we're so thankful like we have a Christian in that position. But if they're like not doing a good job, like they kind of are actually at odds with God.
right. So I think I would agree with what you're getting at. I might word it slightly differently, and perhaps we'll go back to our sports analogy. So if you have, like, on the one hand, let's say the sport of soccer. Like,
Yeah.
it's pretty easy for me to conceive of a person who's a really good soccer player but an awful Christian, or not a Christian. Very easy for me to imagine that person. Okay, somebody's good at soccer, but they're not a Christian. They're 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 going to hell. They don't know Christ. They're lost. Conversely, I can imagine somebody that's a very good Christian but is terrible at soccer. Right.
Right.
And so if soccer is a vocation and being a Christian is a vocation, let's say on the other end, they're very good at this one, they're not very good at this one. What our tradition is saying, based on the biblical text, is that there's a vocation that is not soccer, it's not Christianity, it is being a prince. That's the word that Luther uses the most, the prince, right? And by that I mean somebody that's not quite a king, not quite like, but like we would think of as like a duke or some kind of governor, some kind of like middle of the road leader. And the thing about that is that vocation isn't like soccer, in the sense that soccer really doesn't have much morality involved in it. Statecraft does. Statecraft has a lot of morality, and it's directly from God. So it's not quite the church, because it's not concerned principally with the next life. It's concerned mostly with this life, but it is entirely an ethical kingdom. And I think that's the kind of paraphrase Stahl. So to go to your point, you could imagine somebody who is a true pious believer, but a crappy prince, has no idea how to run a government, no idea how to do anything, can't get the trains to run on time. And that person, while a good Christian, is a bad prince. We could imagine somebody who is a very effective administrator, a very effective, promoter of morality, but not actually a converted believer. And there is a sense in which that person might be more effective as a leader on that vocation. Just like we can imagine somebody who is a good father, but not a believer. And we could imagine somebody who is a believer, but just is very bad at that vocation. Here's the caveat, and I think this is where our pious listeners might push, is to say, well, yes, but ideally, following the true God would sanctify you along that path of fatherhood and along the path of rulership. And that topic for another time, because we don't want to jump the gun, but that is the concept of the Christian prince.
Right.
But in the nutshell, yes, I understand what you're saying, and I think that that is correct, that we are saying there is a job, and it's not soccer, but it's not the church. It's the vocation of being a magistrate, of being a governor, of being in the state.
Yeah.
And you are in that role whether or not you are a Christian or not. So
Yeah. No, I think that's really well said. And yeah, I mean, just even to push against my own, I don't even know if my view, it's like I'm kind of wrestling through this as we record it, is like the upshot would, yeah, be like, well, can somebody actually further the temporal kingdom if they don't actually know the Lord, like how does that actually work? And you can kind of get into natural theology and kind of like, yeah, that those things are written on every man's heart, and so they kind of like tacitly are aware of it and know it. And would it be better, if they were, in the family, as it were? Like, of course, I think that's the ideal. But many times in a fallen world, we're not working with ideals. We're not working with shooting for kind of utopia. We're saying, hey, these are the cards we've got. And so how do we kind of maximize that, still moving towards the ideal, but realizing that's not going to come in this life.
for sure. No, I think that's well said. Okay. So I guess we'll move to the third proposition. I think this is probably our most controversial today. So here's our hot take.
Okay, here we go.
Proposition 3 is the state is a naturally hierarchical institution, or you might say it's a naturally hierarchical set of vocations. Now, there's a verse, it's kind of obscure, but I think it's helpful. It's from Ecclesiastes, chapter 10, verse 17. It says, "Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness." Okay. Now, I think that's important because, on the one hand, if it's saying, "Blessed are you, O land, and your king is the son of nobles," I think the implication is that there would be something not blessed about a land whose king was not the son of nobles. Now, I don't think that this verse is teaching that, like, you have to be from the nobility to be the king. But I think what it's saying is that there are roles and there's like a fittingness to people running society, right? If our president was yesterday a homeless drug addict, we are a cursed land. Like, that's not a good thing, right? We want our leaders to be
Right.
sober, to be responsible, to be virtuous, to be from the right class and crop of people to be in those roles. And I think that the end of that verse, when it says, "And your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness," right? So now they're talking about, these are people who are eating not so that they can get drunk, but so that their bodies are prepared for the work before them. But the implication is that not everybody is called into the vocation of government. Not everybody's a prince. Not everybody's a king. Not everybody's a
Yep.
knight, right? We
Yeah.
all have different places in the social order in society. And I'm going to like quote the like great conservative Edmund Burke when he says, all men are equal, have equal rights, but not to equal things. We are not all going to equally function in this vocation. There's going to be differences. If you live in a society where you don't even have the right to vote, your role in the state is probably pretty limited. It's probably limited to obedience and prayer for the most part. If you live in a society where you have some kind of authority or role, and maybe God has put you in that position, then it's going to be different. This basically means we don't really require consent. We believe in authority, not majority. It's not consent or a majority that makes something correct. It's an authority that comes from God. And this notion, I mean, it's consistent with Edmund Burke when he says he's mocking the social contract idea. He says it is a contract, but it's a partnership between the living, the dead, and those not yet born. Okay. So we're talking about something that sort of transcends time. And so therefore, if it comes from this hierarchy that's natural that God has created on earth, and those people are called into this vocation according to their ability and kind of God's providential way of governing the world, this is a way of saying that society is going to be naturally layered, right? And that there are layers to authority. Okay, so vocation then, or excuse me, the state is a team sport. It's not an individual sport. It's not a sport where you're like, okay, every country has a king and that's it. No, every country cannot function with just one authority, right? The king has got
Right.
to have lieutenants and advisors and princes and troops. And like we're talking about the fire department, right? Like, there are so many different layers to the authority of the government. It's not just one thing. It is one thing in that it's all united to provide for the temporal needs of the people on earth, both believer and non-believer, right? That's the two kingdoms. But
Right.
it is layered. So the state isn't just Donald Trump. It's not just Governor Newsom. It's not just the mayor of your city. It goes way down in layers, and each of those layers has an authority from God. So we talked about this a little bit offline with a household, right? That you get a household big enough, and if you think of the state as kind of like a very, very big household, you've got dad, but you've got mom. You've got the older brothers, right? If you have a big age gap between the oldest kids and youngest kids, there's going to be different layers of authority. Mom's going to have a certain authority. Dad's going to have a certain authority. The older kids are going to have a certain authority over the younger kids in certain contexts. And so if you just look at it in terms of this collapsed view to say, well, dad's in charge, you're going to miss the fact that, well, yes, but mom actually has authority too, right? The scripture says, honor thy father and thy mother. And so there's going to be different layers of authority here. And I think this is really significant because it shows us that just like the guy at the top receives his authority from God, so the ones in the middle and at the bottom also receive their authority from God. So if you're the mayor of a town of 10 people, your authority is from God. If you're president of the United States, your authority is from God. And they don't depend on any mediation for that to exist. But it basically means that these all receive an authority from God. They all have a role. They all have a function. And we could talk about that some other time if we get into what you were touching on earlier with resistance theory, because that directly fits into resistance theory as well. So if you have any questions
yeah,
about
big time.
that, go out there.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think it makes sense, as you kind of referenced when we were talking offline, like coming back to kind of maybe synthesize a little bit of where we're at is this estate, it exists in the temporal kingdom and it has real authority because the one who holds all authority, the Lord Jesus Christ, has given it. He instituted it. He caused it. He created it. He formed it, and he infused it with real authority to specific to accomplish specific purposes. And just like in a house, and so he gives that real authority, just like in a house. I'm the dad, my wife's husband. I am the leader of our home. We built a home, but like I built each one of my kids their own room, and it's their room. I built it. It's their room. I painted it their favorite color. Their bed is in there. Their toys are in there. But the only reason it's theirs is because I gave it to them. And so in one sense, it's all mine, but like they actually have the real decision-making power and agency to go in there and play with their toys.
Right.
And so, but I have the right and the obligation as to when they are misusing them, they're taking the toy and hitting their brother or sister with it, to step in. And if they say, oh, hey man, this is mine. It's like, hold on a minute, buddy. Actually, everything you own is mine, including the toy that you're using to beat your sister with. And so, you got to straighten up. You can't, that's not the purpose of this. Or if they're mistreating their friends or breaking one of the house rules, then I have the obligation to step in. The other way that this plays out specifically to this kind of third statute that you've put forward is the hierarchical nature is, our oldest is a girl. She's gonna be a 9-year-old girl. And I don't know if it's a firstborn thing. I'm number 2 in the family, so I don't know, but I've heard that firstborn children love to speak on behalf of mom, even though they haven't been instructed to do so. And
you don't say.
So, yeah. And so my daughter will sometimes go and tell her brother, hey, you need to clean up your room or, whatever it might be. And it'll cause like a little bit of a problem. But here's where it gets a bit different is there are times where she is allowed to tell her little brother or little sister what to do. And it's because I instructed her to. And so there are times where she steps out of line and starts saying or instituting things in the house where I'm like, hey, you're not dad, you're not mom, like go sit down and eat your dinner. Like you don't need to, get involved in this or try to make somebody else do something. There are times though where I say, hey, Stella, go and tell your brother to put his shoes on. And if he says no, you tell him, dad told me to tell you. And so you can see where this connection is, where if she's speaking on my behalf with the actual words and instruction that I gave her, then she does actually wield that same or similar authority. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at.
Yes. Yeah. And I think I'm specifically I'm thinking of like great Christian saints in the past, because if you have this view that subordinate authority is also from God directly, you will, when you're in that subordinate, or that what the reformers call the lower magistrates, the lesser magistrates, sorry. When the lesser magistrates view their role as from God, there's a kind of like another check and balance in there, where I'm not just looking to the person above me, but I'm
Right.
also saying that I have authority. I give an example, like, in the military, commissioned officers have different ranks, right? And if you have a general, whether you're a general and you're over a division, or you're a captain over a company, or a lieutenant over a platoon, ultimately what we're saying is you have authority from God. And
Yeah.
therefore you are accountable for what you do. If you're a captain, you're not just accountable to your lieutenant colonel or whoever is your brigade commander. You're accountable to God, because he is the one who gave you that authority and puts you in that position. And I think that's another like layer of checks and balances, because it forces somebody to say, okay, well, if my job on the team is to be this, I need to do my job well, and I need to do it for the Lord and under his will.
I think that's good too, because it really does incentivize you to just do a good job, whether it goes noticed or celebrated or promoted or not, because God sees everything. And so, yeah, it just kind of removes oh, when boss is around, I work extra hard so that he gives me a promotion or an attaboy. But it's like, no, like this is, and that's kind of what it means to have integrity, is just you are who you are all the time. If it gets noticed, great. If it doesn't get noticed, no problem, because God notices it. And yeah, so when it comes from God, it's like there is that level of accountability. Yeah, maybe your boss didn't see you're the mayor and you invited the governor to, oversee some city project, and he didn't even show up. He didn't even respond to your invite. Well, we don't really need to, we can cut corners and we can kind of, maybe skim a little off the top. It's like, no, because God sees it. And at the end of the day, you are going to be accountable to him. And yeah, so I think you're right to say that it adds that little extra check.
Yeah, and I think of the quote kind of fits with the quote from First Peter that we read about, honor the brotherhood, honor the emperor. I think John Fisher, when he was set to be executed by Henry VIII, he said, "I die the king's servant, but God's first." And I think that's a great way to think of it, is that, he's being killed by his own king, whom he served as chancellor, I believe. And he's
Yeah.
saying, I'm still your servant, but I'm
Hmm.
God's first. And I think that fits so many biblical examples, right? We have the biblical examples of Daniel, right, being one of the like wisest men in Babylon. He's serving a heathen king. He's serving him faithfully, but he's God's servant first. He's God's boy first.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately because his position is from God, not from Nebuchadnezzar. Or think of Joseph, right? I just got done reading the Joseph story, and think of Joseph, the positions that he executed,
Yeah.
you know,
Big time.
right? And whether that was from Potiphar or from Pharaoh. So we have these examples in the Bible also of men acting in their vocational contexts, and even though like Potiphar gave him the job, Pharaoh gave him the job, it ultimately was from God, right? So I'll leave it at that, brother. Okay. So number 4, this is the fourth proposition we're going to defend, and that's the state is a quasi-sacred institution or vocation. Now, we could say quasi because it's not a sacrament, right? Becoming a prince or a magistrate or a mayor is not a sacrament. It's not in the church.
Yeah.
It's for this age, but the temporal points to the eternal. I think this is like a fundamental principle, that there is a sense in which the temporary points to the eternal, the material points to the immaterial, the earthly king points to the heavenly king, right? And I
Yes.
think this is why we, in our tradition, always prefer a state as opposed to just a ruler, as opposed to just a strong man, because we're saying it's not just what he is as a person, but it's the office, it's the role, it's the vocation that he is
Yeah.
functioning, right? And not to say that we're anti-monarchical, because actually most Christians historically have been monarchists, but we're
Yeah.
saying because there's an obligation to provide, protect, and maintain order that transcends just an individual, we tend to prefer continuity, order, and a fixed constitution because we want the blessings of good government to survive the death of any individual, right? We don't want it to be just, this is why we form corporations and not just sole proprietorships, right? If I just go out and start a landscaping business and I die, the business dies with me. If I start Von Esch Landscaping Incorporated, that entity will live on beyond my death. That's why it can be publicly traded. And so what we want in our tradition is the state to be like that. The state to be this office, this function that continues beyond one individual because it exists for the goal of the good of all people in that society and because it bears obligations directly to God. Now, I will also say there's a part of where enforcing the law and enforcing the social order promotes and drives us to the eternal. So I think there's a connection here also with like the death penalty and capital punishment, but I don't want to get us too upfield. But there is a sense in which I just had a sentencing today where somebody got sentenced to 50 years to life. That I think that sentencing, it's a temporal punishment. It's a long, long sentence, but stands for ultimately the final judgment, right? Like where we see like everyone's going to have to stand before the bema seat, the judgment seat of Christ. The analogy there is we know what it is or can see what it's like to be sentenced by an earthly judge. And so we can now think in fear that there is a judge who can throw both body and soul into hell, right? And so in a sense, reverencing the authorities and seeing them as quasi-sacred actually builds piety for the one true God. And it does this by kind of teaching people to fear the one who's in authority. Think of Romans 13, right? Fear whom is in authority because he can put you to death. And I think this is super important when we think about how we look at the institution of government, when we look at what it does in terms of pushing us toward like recognizing the authority and majesty of God. I also think it's one of the reasons why it's pretty much ubiquitous in our traditions, the Protestant traditions, that when we look at the commandments, the commandment to honor thy father and mother is seen as the foundation for government. Because that text, if whether it's Luther or Calvin, whoever, they look at that and say, look, this is saying to honor the natural authorities that are put over you. And God is concerned about that because honoring them is ultimately a way of honoring him. It teaches us to honor him, right? If you don't know to fear your father on earth, you're not really going to know to fear your heavenly father. And so is a sense in which, enforcing order on earth and doing that points us to the eternal. And I think that is a concept that our tradition has. I'll kind of leave it at that unless you have a.
I typically run my kind of analogies past you, but because we're hot on the sports analogies, it's kind of like we all know what baseball is. And like when a kid first starts to learn to play baseball, like they all play t-ball first. But that's like not actually like baseball in its purest form. If you go to a major league game, like they don't bring out the tee and set the ball on the tee, for whoever the big slammer is to come up and, knock a home run. It's like, that's not baseball in its purest sense, but it's like, it's a step in which the kid can take to learn how to play baseball is put the ball on the tee, and take some hacks. And it's kind of like that in a sense. It's like, this is still what it means, what it is to honor God and know what it means to be under authority. And so, this is kind of the T-ball of what the eternal realm is going to be like one day. And so it's something that it has to be through a material means because we're material beings. And so you and I talk a lot about that, about how all of the temporal things, material things, things that we can see, touch, feel are not the purest thing. They're not the realist thing. The realist is the spiritual realm. And so, I don't know if the T-ball thing makes sense, but I kind of was thinking about that since we've been using sports analogies. I was like, that's kind of is what it is. It's like, hey, you're going to get your time in the batter's box, but without the consequence of somebody throwing a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. So I'll stop with the analogy so it doesn't get played out. But
no, I think it works. I think it's worth also pointing out that, if we look at the tables of the law, right, The first table being the commandments that govern our relationship vertically with God, right? And then the second table being the commandments that govern our
Yeah.
relationship with other humans. The
Right.
first commandment of ours with other humans is the honor thy father and thy mother. I mean, that's
Right.
before murder, that's before
Yep.
lying. And
Yep.
so it's interesting that the Lord reveals this honoring of natural authority as a foundation of the others that follow it, right? And just like the table that deals with our relationship with God begins with, you have no other gods before me. And the rest, so you might look at as kind of explications of that. You kind of jogged my memory to talk a little bit about this notion of pietas or
Yeah.
piety, right? This is a
Yep.
Roman virtue, and the virtue is sort of behaving properly toward your ancestors, your city, your gods, right? And it's a pagan virtue. It pre-exists Christianity, but when Christianity takes over the Roman Empire, the Christians basically say this is a right virtue. They just have the wrong
Yeah.
gods. And
Yep.
so, pietas is the like it's a virtue that we don't really use, but it's a great one because it would encompass like a bunch of things that we would kind of intuitively connect, but wouldn't be able to easily. It would basically be like the same virtue that would cause us to kneel in prayer and the same virtue that would cause us to take care of our grandmother when she's sick and old and the same virtue that would cause us to stand for the national anthem would all fit under this role. It's a proper orientation, a proper like veneration, respect due to the things that oblige me. And I think that fits very well. We were mentioning offline how the old adage pro auras et focus, like for our graves and altars, the Christians took it for God and country. And you might look at like for God and country as a way of saying for all that is good and sacred, right?
Right.
It's everything that has an obligation on me, like has this kind of pull, right? And I think that actually fits in with patriotism, right? Because we think of patriotism as like you're for your country, but patrios, like patriotism is from the Greek word patrios, which means from the fathers. So a patriot is somebody who's zealous for the way of there's fathers, and so there's sort of like this built-in piety. And I think our tradition, the Christian tradition, the Protestant tradition, sees the state as functioning in this way. And so a proper like respect due to it fits with a proper respect of God. And that's why I think you see, that verse we just read from First Peter chapter 2, right? Honor the brotherhood, honor, like they're all these sort of like dispositions toward things that are sacred or holy or worthy of respect. So that's pretty much all I got to say on that fourth point, David, unless you have anything to add.
Yeah. No, man, let's keep rolling.
Okay. All right. The last proposition, the ideal state, while not bringing the kingdom of God, would support and defend the church and the true faith. Okay. Say it again. The ideal state, while not bringing heaven on earth, would support and defend the church and the true faith. Now, I'll start by saying this is the Christian ideal. It's not necessary that the state do this to be legitimate, but because the state is subject under the rulership of Christ, it too must bend the knee when there is a conflict, meaning Christ is king. And I'm going to read from the second Psalm that says, "Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them his wrath and vex them into sore displeasure. Yet I have set my king up on my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, Thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the outermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, and shalt dash them into pieces like a potter's vessel. Be wise now, therefore, O kings, and be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice and trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him." Now, why I like that psalm is because clearly it's talking about Christ, but it's telling the kings of the earth, kiss the Son, bend the knee, fear him, right? Jesus is king. And if he's king over everything, then the kings of the earth, right, is what he's called the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That like ultimately those authority structures, though they don't have to honor him to be legit, they don't have to honor him to be there. The ideal form is that they would kiss the Son, lest they perish in the way. And I'd say this as a way of saying that ideally, our tradition has taught that the state or the magistrates would support and defend the true church, that they would not, certainly not suppress it, they would certainly not harm it, they would not impede it in its evangelism and its work, but encourage it. And most of our tradition has taught they should do everything they can in their power to sort of promote it while not taking over their role by basically saying, look, they have a job to do. It's not mine. But if I'm going to defend them, I'm going to defend them. And again, it kind of highlights the idea of the Christian prince, but that's a concept for another time. Anyways, that's what I got, David.
Yeah, dude, I love that. Let me look at it. Yeah, that passage that you read is, yeah, I think one thing to just kind of riff off that a little bit is it's almost as if it's in the state's best interest to prop up and support and ensure the flourishing of the church because it produces the best societies. I mean, if you just look at what are the societies that have done the most socially, that are like pro-human, protective of rights, that flourish on every metric that matters, it's Protestant societies. And so if the state was wise, they would say, hey, we want you to succeed. We don't want to do your job. They cannot administer the sacraments. They cannot bind and loose sins. There are so many things that the government cannot do. But what they can do is in the temporal material space, ensure that the church has everything that it needs to flourish and move forward and accomplish its goals. And so in one way, it's not subordinate to the church, but it is a service to the church. Maybe that's one way to think about it. And so, yeah, I mean, if you were to try to just run a comparison, we've talked about this, but just the most flourishing, healthy societies, in the metrics that matter to God, they're all Protestant. And so, yeah, the state would be wise to kiss the Son, to see that as their part in the game, their role, their position to play is to ensure that this is able to happen and not be hindered in any way.
Right, right. Yeah. And I might add on that just as like throw a bone to our Roman Catholic brothers. I mean, think to the extent that our societies have deviated from that in historical Protestant countries, I think it's been to our detriment, right? That we've thought of ourselves wiser than God to not kiss the Son and not acknowledge that we really do depend on him and our kings depend on him to be effective. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that we can talk a lot about how that's been done historically, right? Not everyone has agreed. There are, societies, Protestant societies that were straight up confessional. Like they had a confession, they enforced that. They had a state church that was, very much like mandatory to be part of. And then we had others that like looked at it more of like, hey, I can't force you to be a Christian, but I'm gonna like really encourage you. I think it was like Queen Elizabeth who kind of tried to like cut this uh like split the baby by basically saying, look, I can't force you to actually like believe the faith, but I
Yeah.
can make you go to church on Sunday. And so like you have to go to church. You don't have to go forward for communion. You don't have to actually believe it because I can't force your conscience. My hope is that in going there and hearing the gospel, you'll be converted, right? And so, like, there are all sorts of like various ways of doing that. Of course, we live in a country where, at least here in the United States, where there's a disestablishment, like there's no state church, there's no state religion, right? There's total freedom of religion, and the state is ostensibly like kind of agnostic. But I think the idea that the ideal state would be promoting the and propping up the Christian message, I think is absolutely a historical teaching of Christianity in general, but also of Protestantism. We can talk about where the lines are on that, and that's a tricky one. But I think we have to contend with the fact that ideally that is the ideal. The ideal country is a country that supports Christian values, that supports the Christian faith, and that's That's our tradition, man.
Yep. Yeah. And to kind of go back to the primary function of this estate that we've been discussing in the temporal realm, in the temporal kingdom, to, quote the great reformer, Martin Luther, once again, for this reason, God has ordained two governments, the spiritual, which by the Holy Spirit and under Christ makes Christians and pious people, and the secular, which restrains the unchristian and wicked so that they must keep the peace outwardly, even against their will. And so that's a big role of it, is saying, hey, you cannot impede, even if you want to disrupt, distract. They may be more in tune with this, but recently there was some like news reporter that stormed into a church or something and was like causing all kinds of problems. And did he just get indicted?
Yeah. Yeah, you did.
I don't know if you're familiar with that case. I don't really know all the details. I just saw some guys stormed a church, disrupted, a church service, and the government seems like they actually did their job. Did he get indicted, or I don't even know what all that happened in that case? Was it Don
My
Lemon?
understanding is that he did get indicted. Don Lemon did get indicted.
Yeah, so he went in and was being disruptive in some way to a gathering in a church. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the allegation. I'm not
Okay.
familiar with the underlying facts, but essentially there was a group of people who disrupted a church service, and I think the accusation that he was part of it. You know what I mean? I think his defense is going to be, I just was filming it. I wasn't really like part of it. But
right, sure.
But to your point, that's a great example. The ideal society, ideal state would not permit that to happen. It would not permit people to disrupt the function of the church. Our tradition is taught like the government can use force to actually like make sure that happens, and to ensure that body is there and done. One thing that you kind of touched on here, especially with the two kingdoms, and this is like one of the things you brought up earlier about how not everything is absolutely cleanly worked out, and that is because we have on the one hand this idea from Luther, right, of the temporal, like food, shelter, water, right, like the basic necessities of life, and the state is certainly interested in that. And then we have like the eternal, like your salvation, your standing before God, your union with Christ, where you go when you die, what happens to your soul. And we can say that's very like spiritual or churchly. And it's not to distinguish spiritual from physical. They're both physical, right? We go to church and we hear with our ears, we receive with our mouths, right?
Yeah, there's overlap for sure.
100%. But it is to say like there's a sort of sense in which like, starting with priority number one, like you're going to want shelter, food, water, etc. But a question, I'll just leave it for our listeners, is at what point, if you're the prince and you're caring for your people's needs, does that also say religion fits into that? Like, I want my kids not just to have clothes, not just to have food, not just to have a house. I want them to know, love, and serve God. I want them to live forever. And I want them union with them. So what can I do to encourage that to happen, knowing that I don't have the power to make it happen myself? And it would seem like the answer is I would bring them to the place where they would receive the gospel. I would put them in a position to venerate and receive it as best as they could. And I certainly would not impede them from doing so, right? So we can look at like the People's Republic of China that is trying to suppress true churches and set up their own churches. We can say that's a wicked regime. Like just straight up, it's a wicked regime to do that. And they don't have the authority to do that. It doesn't come from God. That's what we call an ultra virus act. That is to say, an act outside of their authority. That's totally legitimate. And right, like a good leader would want their people to go down that path. So there, and that goes back to the eternal leading, the temporal leading us to the eternal. Right. And it's a simple, you do the simple thought experiment, right? You and I are teenagers and we let's say like we crash out in the Canadian wilderness and you and I have to survive probably like day one. If we're not Christians, we're going to be, if we're Christians, we're praying to God help us, right? If we're not Christians though, maybe we're praying to the unknown God. I don't know. We're just trying to get food and some shelter in a cave. But eventually if we stabilize and we're out there, we start to say, what's the purpose of all this, right? Like, why are we here? It's a very natural like move. And so I'll leave it at that. But I think fitting into why the temporal fits into the eternal is because if you're doing your job right and you're trying to care for your citizens and give them a good life, you're also trying to meet the needs that are spiritual and that are not just satisfied for today. But if you're the state, that means you have to bring them in contact with the church. You have to, in some way, hope
Yeah.
and pray that the church interacts there. But definitely a lot of details and a lot to work out in that particular point. So I'll leave it at that, my man.
No, that's really good, bro. So maybe, as we kind of begin to try to maybe put the landing gear down and approach the runway, what would maybe be like a couple ways that would be Protestant for us to be thinking about when we're thinking about what is the relationship between the church? And this is kind of what you're alluding to, I think, is what the relationship between the church and the government are. Because I think when it comes to the home, for some reason, I think that most people, and it could just be because of what's transpired in the last couple of years with kind of the woke agenda and things of that nature, like people have wholesale rejected, hey, you cannot be part of my home, you cannot be part of my family. The government, I don't think we have that same knee-jerk reaction. People were kind of all over the map, particularly COVID. That's kind of the most recent example that we kind of have of when there really was tension between government, kind of this estate, the temporal estate, and the eternal state. And there was just a lot of tension, and people really did land on different decisions, and they went about it different ways. And so what would be, so that's like a case study, I guess, or in recent memory, people are probably thinking like, oh, did the government overstep? How could, we mentioned resistance theory, and maybe we'll dive into those things later, but maybe just like kind of going forward with these things in mind, what would be some of your hopes that our listener would maybe have maybe not a totally new frame of mind or filter, but maybe, hey, here's just like some food for thought as we remember to pray for our leaders. Like what are we hoping for from them? I think there's probably two camps, and then I'll turn it over to you. There's probably one camp that is like, they're useless, they're corrupt, they're never going to be for me, they're just crushing me, they're out for themselves, they don't know God, they don't fear God. It's that ship has left the harbor and it's never coming back. And then there's some people, so maybe how would you speak to that person? And then the person that is like, nope, Trump should be the Pope, he should be the president, he should be the king, he should be the arbiter of good and evil. And it's basically, Jesus in the flesh 2026. There's people those are kind of the extremes that I think people are at, they just like wholesale love it or wholesale like, nope, never going to help me. Doesn't matter. Maybe what would be some of your hopes for our listener to, how do we take a biblical approach? For that's what it means to be Protestant, is we want to take the biblical imperatives, truths, and apply them, and then have them inform our thinking and our action. And so maybe, what would be some of your ways that you would hope people would kind of grapple with maybe either one of those, too much hope in the government, no hope at all? What would be a
Yeah.
couple of your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for the person, I'll start with the person who has no hope. I think the answer is, but it's God's will. I think that's like, something to kind of just digest. Just like, we're talking about the vocation of the household. If somebody said like family sucks, my dad abused me, and that, that happens a lot,
Sure.
right? You could see somebody
Yeah.
sort of like checking out on the institution of marriage, institution of the family. But I think you have to say like the Christian message is like, ultimately that's how God's ordered the world. And so it's like both a descriptive thing, like they're just describing reality, but it's also normative in the sense of that is how God has chosen to order us on the earth now until the coming of our Lord, the return of our Lord. So I think I'd say the person who's kind of given up is to say, maybe we don't have the luxury of completely giving up in terms of like wanting them to do better and having a plan for them. In terms of the people who are, I don't know, maybe kind of like overly messianic about the state, I think that there is a temptation, and you see it with people who are non-believers. If you were to remove God, you would worship the state. And that's because of all of the things that kind of exist, it's the most powerful, right? So I think you have people who have a secular religion and they don't have the cross of Christ that redeems every sin and every broken thing and every, we would say apart from the cross of Christ, there's no hope for mankind. But if you
Yeah,
don't have a cross
totally.
of Christ, you have people that are going to say, well, like a social welfare program or whatever it is, or if you're on the other side of the political aisle, some strong, great leader who is going to lead you to the path, of flourishing or whatever, but they cannot save. The magistrates cannot save us. They're ultimately going to disappoint us. They're going to let us down. They are ultimately only provisional, and they go and pass with time. And I think the ultimate thing is kind of going back to that Psalm 2, like when Jesus returns, it's not going to, like, there's going to be the kings of the earth need to kiss the Son, right? And so everything that they have has to kind of conform, I think, ultimately to God's will. That doesn't mean that you can't be excited about politics or a political movement or whatever, or think it's best for your country. That's fine, but understand that that happens provisionally. Kind of another thought I have on that too, and I think this happened on literally every side of the COVID issue, is a lot of things came down and people made them gospel issues. And I think that historically what the Protestant doctrine of the state is saying is there are just honestly like people who may be genuine Christians, but just be dumb or wrong or mistaken about the facts. And we might disagree completely on politics, but they be true Christians. They have the freedom of a Christian, like Martin Luther talks about, that they're absolutely saved. And I'll tell you the truth. Hopefully no one says this. I find most pastors to be terrible at politics, but I haven't met a pastor that I'm like, yeah, dude, I agree with everything he says. Like, there's usually something off about it, and I think that I look at that guy and I'm like, I love that dude. He's a great guy. He's a great leader. God has put him in this vocation, but I'm not voting for him. And it's nothing to do with anything other than I think there can be reasonable disagreement, and we're fallible humans, and this is the kingdom of the left hand. We're dealing with left hand questions. Doesn't mean there's not a right answer or a wrong answer, but it means there's not always a divine law answer. Now, there are some things that are, right? Like, we can never have the state say what is evil is good, or command you to do what God forbids, or forbid you to do what God commands. But when I know you mentioned COVID, that's where it got complicated, right? Because if you have a state like my home state, I said you can't go to church, but you can go to Home Depot. You can't go to church, but you can go to a cannabis dispensary. I think that raises legitimate questions as to what is the social benefit of a cannabis dispensary versus the worship of the triune God. And I don't think you could put them on the same plane. So I could legitimately see why there are people say that would kind of inappropriate or whatever.
Overreach. Yeah.
Overreach, yeah. But yeah, I think that to summarize, it's what we have. It's the vocation that God has created, how to order society here on earth, but it's ultimately not going to save us. It is not going to save us, man. And if there's anything we can look back on history, there are times where Christians, particularly I think of prior to World War I, had messianic views of what their governments could do and how cleaning up society was going to bring heaven on earth, and that was proven to be a gross exaggeration of what was possible.
Yeah, it's misleading. Yeah, man. No, I appreciate those encouragements, exhortations, if you will. And yeah, I think you hit it right on the head, man. I think for the person that's overly has no hope, I think at bare minimum, we are under commands to pray for our leaders. And so even if we don't feel like it, even if we have a worse leader than you have, or our mayor, or our governor, or our president isn't what we want, we're still just like we're commanded by the Lord Jesus to pray for our enemies. We're commanded, we're required. Our conscience is bound by this command to pray for those who are in authority over us. And whether we like that or not, that's the command. We don't understand it. We don't understand how God is using this really broken thing because of our doing for his ultimate purposes and glory. And it's understandable. There's a lot of really bad things that happen and take place and get exposed. Let us not go as far as questioning the sovereignty of God, the providence of God, the care of God, that he's gonna work this out. I mean, you could almost see it as like when my kids don't want to get in the car because they didn't finish their cartoon, not to trivialize things in the world, but It's like they don't understand, like, I'm actually taking them somewhere that's better than the cartoon. Now they got to get in the car. Air conditioning's not on yet. It's hot. They don't want to, whatever, but they don't see the whole picture. They don't see the destination. And so let us not grow weary of trusting God, that we can still, and we can also see change. I mean, people never would have thought in the early church that the Roman Empire would be Christian. I mean, that had to have been, they're the ones that crucified Christ. And then to think that, in a few hundred years, there would be large swaths of Christians throughout the empire. That's pretty miraculous. So that's one. And then the person that's overzealous, there is a new city coming. That's what John sees in Revelation. There is a new city that descends, that all the other things have passed away. And so, just be careful to not make that into an idol or a requirement, like a gospel issue, like what you were saying, because this will go away. It's temporal. It has a purpose. It's instituted by God, has real authority, but it also has an expiration date. And there will be a new city that will be ushered in. And the one on the throne is not your political leader. It is the Lord Jesus Christ himself. And the Bible says in the Old Testament, it's giving us new covenant language. And it says, and God will be with them as their God, and they will be with him as his people. And that's going to be what we're going to have. We're going to have the city of God, unhindered, not fallen, but perfected in glory. And it's going to be real. I think it's going to be something that is even greater than what we experience in the 3D sense of here and now. So whatever material it is or will be comprised of is going to be better, and it's going to be new. And so, yeah, I think just to remember that the goal isn't that your party wins and that everybody, bows to that candidate, but that, we do long for a day where everything will be made right. And that will not take place until everybody bows before the Lord Jesus Christ. And so, yeah.
No, that's good, dude. And I think, to connect it to eschatology, because I think you've done it, like, the Tower of Babel, right? Trying to build your way up to heaven doesn't work. And Revelation shows us that the city of God descends, right? Like it's not like we're not going to work our way up there. God's going to have to bring it down. You know what I mean? And so 100%, dude. Everything you said was very solid.
That's really good, man. Well, as the plane begins to land, where are we going from here, man? What we've got. So we've covered in episode 4, we covered the estate of the household. We've done our best to deliver something worthy of hopefully listening to, that discussed the estate of the government, the civil magistrate, as we've discussed today. So what do we kind of have left in the kingdom of the two doctrines?
Well, brother, we're going to move on to the doctrine of the church. So buckle up, guys. This will be a good one, both the visible and invisible church. And I think what we'll do with these 3 estates after we finish an episode on the church, is we'll probably circle back along different topics related to the estates, because there's so much for us to unpack, particularly with Protestant social teaching. But we're going to be moving on to the church, which I would say of all 3 of these is actually probably the most neglected of the estates in contemporary Protestant teaching. So yeah, it'll be good.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the estate of the church it really is what the thing that you and I would talk most about, actually. We kind of say we started this podcast because we're basically just pressing record on phone calls that we've been having for the last 10 years, and decided to kind of let other people listen if they want to. And it really has primarily circled around the state of the church and where things have lost their way. And if you haven't listened to, I think it was episode 2, kind of giving a little bit of context to where we see the state of the church, I think is maybe what we called it, and just kind of how we use Nehemiah's, the walls are broken, the evangelical church and the fundamentalists and the modernists and fundamental controversy in early 20th century, kind of set the stage for things getting off the tracks. And so, yeah, we'll kind of dive in much deeper than just 20th century, but we'll go all the way back to what is the church? What is it that Christ founded? How does it function in the right hand in the eternal kingdom? And so we'll kind of, we'll do our best to put something forth worth watching or listening to.
Absolutely.
Any closing thoughts, Barrett, before I kind of give like a little outro?
No, that's it, brother.
Great. Well, thanks, man. I really appreciate you. And thanks for putting an outline together. And to all of our listeners, those who've watched, we're trying to put some of this out on YouTube. And for those of you that are part of our Patreon community, thank you. And as always, you get this content 2 weeks before everybody else. And so you kind of get some exclusive cuts and full episodes and all of that before it goes out publicly to anybody else. So for those of you that are jumping in the fight through Patreon and liking and subscribing to our YouTube content, thank you so much. And we really do hope to build a coalition of brothers to really rediscover what it means to be classically Protestant and put forth some content out there. And in the future, we really do hope to get into a little bit more some of the polemics of what makes us a Protestant and what doesn't make us a Roman Catholic, and what doesn't make us Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox or Oriental or any of the other traditions. Why are we Protestant? And so down the runway are some of those videos and content. But thank you so much. If you do listen, if you enjoy our content, please just subscribe to our channel, and it'll help us gain a little bit of momentum so we can continually put this content out. And so thanks, Barrett, and all those who watched and listened. And may the Lord bless you and use this so that we can continue to be in the fight and put forth a good representation of what it means to be classically Protestant. All right, Barrett. Thank you, brother. God bless you.